So
Okay.
trend number three for the decade that we identified jointly and expanded upon was well what you termed letting the development piper call the tune. Now I had to get you to expand on that a little bit, but it sounds to me as though this is connected to the first trend in so much as this comes out of budgeting and English heritage in particular. So shall we expand on that initially? 5 minutes, go.
Okay. Press the button and Brockman goes. No, this is something that has been an issue at a level in certainly British archaeology since the late 1980s when developer funded archaeology came in with PPG 16.
Hmm.
It
Planning
became much
policy
more of an issue.
guidance. Planning
Policy
policy.
planning guidance
Yep.
16, which basically took on the European Union principle of the polluter pays,
Yes.
to make anybody coming up with a development proposal pay for an archaeological assessment and, if necessary, archaeological excavation
Hmm.
and recording and conservation of any archaeology that would be destroyed by their development,
Yes.
the pollution being the development.
Hmm.
Um, that came in the late 1980s with PPG 16. But and the situation was broadly stable. It created the big archaeological contracting units that we with now, like Wessex Archaeology, Museum of London Archaeology, Oxford Archaeology, and the others, who carry out this work for developers. It created independent consultants who, again, the are used by both the contracting units and by the developers. So you often have an archaeologist on both sides. So you've got an archaeologist putting forward an archaeological plan, and you have an archaeological consultant for the developer saying, that's rather expensive and we don't really need that aspect of it, do we?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so that was happening already. 2010, the Cameron-led coalition comes in. They want to simplify bureaucracy, cut red tape, as most incoming governments say they're going to do.
Hmm.
They replaced PPG 16 with the National Planning Policy Framework, which is a lot fewer pages. It's one document rather than a whole series of
A
documents.
lot fewer. A lot fewer. Is that good English? Anyways, we haven't got time. Come on, move on. So go on.
Um, and but at the same time, other budget cuts will go. The other budget cuts were going
Yep.
on. Um, English Heritage then was heavily cut back and was given a shotgun divorce, in that it was split in half, and the National Collection of Historic Buildings and Sites, like Dover Castle and Stonehenge and so on, was floated off to a charity called
Effectively
English
creating
Heritage,
a second national trust in that
creating a
sense.
second national
Yeah.
trust,
Yeah. Whereby
duplicating
whereby
something that was
the public subsidizes it through membership and visiting and yeah, that kind of yeah.
absolutely,
Hmm.
with
Yep.
buildings which it actually already owned and was subsidising through taxation, but we
Hmm.
won't go there.
No, no.
Um, and Historic England was kept in-house as the government's statutory advisor on matters archaeological
Mm.
and heritage. Um, the same thing was happening with Natural England, who deal with the natural environment. The upshot of all this, coupled with a drive to make planning simpler for developers, people pointed out the coincidence that many of the people funding the Conservative Party and individual Conservative MPs are from the buildings industry. Nothing to see here, guys. Move along, please. Um, the, um, the idea has become
Well,
current.
the quote at the time was that the
Go on.
policy was unashamedly pro-development, wasn't it? It was that
Honest, yeah.
unashamedly that was Osborne's.
George Osborne has probably been photographed in a high vis jacket more often than your average plumber.
Yeah.
Um, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and what some of his for example, the person that he commissioned to write a government report on simplifying the planning process was a director of British Land, which is one of the biggest developers in the country.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and so just looking at the timer, so one of the issues then is that, and I think you quite eloquently put this in the past. You've in the frame in the you framed this as being the case that organisations like English Heritage were no longer there to put the case for heritage, a case which sometimes they would lose, but rather they became people who were facilitating development. They were at best they had a new focus. At worst, they were even becoming enablers on some sites, helping people to find a way
That's
to do the building that otherwise might not be in the best interest of the heritage itself.
and precisely, and we're seeing that playing out at the moment, for example, in Stonehenge and also
Mm,
on the Goodwin Sands, which
mm.
we'll come to. But
And Battle of
basically,
Bosworth Field as well.
and Battle of
Bosworth Field.
Bosworth,
Yeah.
yeah, the Bosworth battlefield. All of those are sites which, on heritage grounds, you would argue are so unique they should have been protected,
Yeah.
and they haven't been, because Osborne very deliberately changed the remit of historic England and natural England from being basically advising on conservation matters to facilitating, quotes, sustainable development, whatever sustainable is.
Yeah. Yeah. Bing. Okay, right. So that's 5 minutes on the the broadly speaking negative element. Um,
Yeah,
but the positive that we identified this as the counterpoint
with some difficulty.
with a little bit of difficulty was the the scope and scale of development now in this country is leading to a scope and scale of some archaeological projects that's truly remarkable, worthwhile acknowledging. And in that
Yeah,
sense, we mentioned Musk Farm and also HS2 and
yes.
Crossrail, in fact. So actually, so I'll take a bit of a lead on that. HS2
Please, yeah, go ahead.
in particular, I think rather cleverly has been talked about as being a timeline.
Mm,
Hey, so it's a railway line that is cutting through, or if it goes ahead as it's planned at the moment, cutting through a huge swathe of the southwest of England, broadly
it's a
speaking.
very clever piece of framing.
Yeah, and as it cuts through that swathe, it is it's inevitably going to be uncovering history and heritage. So some key aspects were uncovered in London. We've talked about this a couple of times in the past, but in and around train stations, for example, they found graveyards. Um, in the countryside, there are sites that are work on private lands that are now being examined by archaeologists, sometimes for the first time. And out of that will come what has been touted as the biggest archaeological project of its kind in Europe. So that's a positive of this idea of the developer and development having its foot on the accelerator a little bit. Um, Sites like Musk Farm I'm less familiar with, but one thing I would say is that another example like HS2 is Crossrail, and Crossrail actually I think is an example where actually they've been able to showcase ways of working and ways of connecting what's found on a building site to publicly accessible research and also museum grade outcomes
Mm,
that are truly actually to be praised. They are, they're
mm,
worthwhile acknowledging, and that they have, and still are in many ways in these projects. They are places where the cutting edge of how to do archaeology, how to do it effectively, and let's face it, how to do it in a way that is developer friendly and therefore time
mm.
methodologically expedient um, is being played out. So that's again that is a positive in terms of practice, I guess, as it relates to
Yeah,
theory.
and
Um,
those if our viewer has a long memory, they might remember back to I think it's Terminal 4 at Heathrow, which is one of the first big joint projects. It was such a big development project that one single contracting unit couldn't take it on. It was done by a consortium,
mm,
and they pioneered things like fast electronic recording and so on, and also the public outreach angle too. So this has been in development, and it was in development before 2010. But what's happened since 2010? You're quite right. These big projects have been remarkable in some of their outcomes,
mhm.
and there's been some terrific work by colleagues who've been involved in them. I think the problem comes really when people take the idea of facilitating sustainable development um, too seriously and deliberately downplay heritage angles to make sure that a planning application will go through.
Mm,
We had you mentioned the battlefield of Bosworth. Historic England were heavily criticised by independent archaeologists and battlefield experts because they took a stance on the economic viability of the Horiba Mira test track that was going to
mhm,
be built. They said in their report that they could see the economic case for the for the project going ahead. That
which they had
wasn't
no
their
reason
place.
to,
That
no reason
they
to.
had no reason
Mm,
to say that, but
mm,
yet they did say that, and that was and we know from responsive councillors voting on had that had some impact.
mm.
In the case of the Goodwin Sands, the consultant for the Port of Dover um, completely failed to understand, or accidentally, deliberately, we don't know, the evidence isn't there, but completely failed to understand that the Protection of Military Remains Act applied, and that they could be breaking the law if they deliberately went in and smashed up crashed military aircraft, of which it was known to be dozens in the area.
No, yeah, yeah, that's true.
So they're either incompetent or culpable. We don't know which yet, but it shouldn't have happened.
Although you have strayed slightly into the negative again there. What I would say is a positive
I'm
out.
balanced. It's balanced. I'm being like the BBC. I'm applying balance.
A positive out of the new Historic England organisation, the one that's still tied to government funding,
Yeah,
is, as I hinted at, Musk Farm. It's been touted as being, well, as is so often the case, something is the Pompeii of X. So this is being called the Pompeii of Britain. Basic Bronze Age settlement found in a quarry near Peterborough, and it is remarkable. It's well worth looking at. At some point, I'll have to make
absolutely.
a video on it. I think it's a very, very good site. So again, positive and negatives for the trend. I think you're quite right, though, to broadly speaking have a raised eyebrow for some of this stuff because, yeah, words like sustainable can be bandied about, but what do they actually mean? That is the question.
And actually, quickly, very, very quickly, final point to end on. It's about valuing expertise, and one of the problems that these developments have brought about is a fracturing of opinion within archaeology world. You've got at Stonehenge, for example, on the World Heritage Site there, the proposed tunnel is being tacitly supported so far by Historic England, the National Trust, and English Heritage, but famously, there was a letter signed by 21 independent expert prehistorians,
Hmm.
basically saying this is an absolute abomination.
Mm,
So that one's still playing out.
yeah. Okay.